Hello everyone and welcome to another video about Gotharman's little deFormer 3. A viewer recently asked me to tell them more about the sequence of the device, so here's a video about that. First, let's very quickly go over some basics again. The little deFormer 3 offers 16 parts, each of which contains sound information like a synthesizer voice or samples, and also each of them contains a sequencer with several sequencer subtracks, so there can be 16 sequences playing at the same time. To select a part, simply hold the part button, and the currently selected part will be lit, like part number 1 now, and we can simply use the step sequencer buttons to choose another part, like part 7, part 10, and so on. Now, I have already prepared some sounds in this preset, so that I can just jump into the sequencer demo right away. Let's choose part 1 again. We can go to the sequencer menu via the touchscreen, edit and sequence, or we can also use the function buttons. We can enable function mode, and then we have sequencer main menu here and note tracks, controller tracks at the press of a button down here. In the sequencer main menu, which is a global menu for all parts, we can select the overall tempo in beats per minute. We can set what's going to be recorded, for example, monophonic MIDI notes or polyphonic MIDI notes, or even audio or chopped audio. Let's leave it at monophonic for now. So now we can attach an external MIDI keyboard and simply record notes from that. We also have options for a metronome. It can be on all the time or only when we're recording. And then we have a global sequence length, which is currently set to 16 steps. Now this is just a global default value, and we can adjust each sequence's length also individually. Below the length we also have a start parameter, so we don't have to start each sequence at step number 1, but we could also start it later. The skip parameter lets us set a global probability for step skipping. So the higher we put that value, the more often steps will be skipped by the sequencer. You can already see in the main menu of the little deFormer 3, things are starting to get crazy. Step Advance is for step record mode, and Notes is the default view that you see when you enter the note track value, and we can change that between value or grid, and we'll see in a bit what that means. There's also a global swing menu where we can have a swing source, which will then affect all the tracks at the same time, or we can of course adjust swing for each track individually. We can also clear the current sequence and enter recording mode, which is also possible with the buttons here or on the preset menu screen. When recording mode is active, we will record whatever is set here, so for example monophonic MIDI note from an external MIDI keyboard, or polyphonic MIDI data, or also audio if we chose that. Okay, let's leave those settings how they are right now and switch to the note track menu. We can do that simply by pressing the note track function button down here. Okay, this should be a familiar view. We have a piano roll here, which we can use to enter notes. We also have 4 potentiometer values up here: octave, bar, last step, and sequence resolution. As usual, those 4 values correspond to the 4 top knobs we have here. So we can use knob 1 to choose which octave we are seeing on the piano roll, knob 2 to choose which bar we are seeing. There can be up to 4 bars. And then the last step can be anything between 1 and 64, which is the maximum length of steps in each sequence. Now, of course, each sequence can have their own length, so we can generate polyrhythms easily as well. The sequence resolution is basically a subdivision of the global clock. So for example, you can make one sequence play twice as fast as another one. All right, let's add some notes then. I'm just going to go to octave number 4, and then I can just simply use my finger to draw notes into the piano roll. When I press play, we won't hear anything yet because we still need to set some triggers. We do that by going to steps mode, and then we can also see the light down here and simply enter steps with the buttons. Now, if we wanted to fine-tune that melody, we can either use our finger or we can use the knobs. And for that we have 2 buttons down here, knobs 1 to 8 and 9 to 16. And let's switch on knobs 1 to 8. And now all those 8 knobs correspond to a step. So I can use the first knob to nudge this note of the first step up and down, and the second knob to nudge this step, and so on. So this is good for fine-tuning. And then we can just switch to knobs 9 to 16 and use the 8 knobs for the second 8 steps in the currently visible sequence part. If you don't like this piano roll grid view, we can also change that to the values view. And for that we simply press the note grid button and it will change into a bar graph of our sequence. So here we can also enter the values with our knobs or simply by drawing with our fingers. The nice thing about this view is that we don't just see one octave like we do in grid mode. So here we can just use the full octave range to draw notes in if we want to do something crazy. Okay, that's cool, but what if we want to do something more musical, like in a traditional musical scale, for example? For that, we have the template screen. And this is currently the template screen to the note value. So here we can set a scale, and we can go through the major and minor scales, and also two experimental ones. And let's set it to G major, for example, and now hit play. So now it will automatically quantize all the notes we enter into a G major scale. And we can of course change that. What we can also do in the template screen for the note values is set a range and then press one of those buttons here to adjust the notes accordingly. For example, we can create a ramp up. When I press this, you will see that we have a ramp which is just rising. And the range then changes how strong this effect is applied. So when I press ramp up with 100, it'll be a perfectly linear ramp. Now, of course, I can destroy that ramp again, and we can just say, okay, let's make it like 50% ramp down. And then we have something that goes down, but still keeps some of our individual note spacings intact. And of course, we can also randomize the steps and scale everything up or down. Okay, let's look at the other tracks apart from the note track in this part. The first one is the gate track, and here we can adjust the gate length for each step. The next track is the velocity track, which would also record velocity data from an external MIDI keyboard, just as the gate track would record gate lengths and the note track would record note values. The velocity data is not hardwired to volume or anything else by default though, so if you want to control the volume of your sound with the velocity track, you have to set that up. This is actually very easy, so let's quickly do this. Just press the function button, go into the VCA menu of your current sound, and there the level can be modulated, not by an envelope, but we want the velocity data, and then we simply turn up the amount, and then we switch back to our note track and go to the velocity subtrack, and then when we play, we can now hear that the velocity is modulating the volume. Alright, that probably wasn't anything new for you, so let's go to the position track. Now here we simply see an upward sloping ramp with values from 1 to 16. And what this means is that step 1 is at step 1, and step 2 is at step 2, and so on. Step 16 is at step 16. But now we can change that. For example, let's move step 16 to step number 2. I'm just going to use the knobs mode here and simply dial in 2. And let's see what happens when we press play now. You can see that when the cursor reaches step number 2, it'll actually play the value from step 16. So this allows us to shuffle the notes we have programmed around in our sequence. And we can also use this to sequence polyphonic sounds. For example, when we shift step 16 to step number 1. So now step 1 will play step number 1, but also step 16 at the same time. And each sequencer track can play 4 notes polyphonically, so we can shift up to 4 notes onto the same step. Alright, let's turn that back to how it was before. And now let's press once more on the position track button, which will bring us into the sub-position track sequencer. Oh my, what do we have here? Now this track is very simple. It allows you to nudge each step a little bit in time so that you can create a per step swing pattern. And we only have 4 values, 0 to 3 here. That will nudge the steps between the adjacent steps around a little bit. that's pretty cool, I think, because it gives you a lot more control than just static swing values that you will find on other groove boxes. What we also have in the sequencer menu is a modulation page. This lets us clear the current track. This lets us enable pitch bend recording or CC recording. It lets us double the current sequence in length up to 64 steps. We can also set the start step of this individual sequence. We can transpose the whole sequence up and down. And we can set up modulation. We can have a modulation source. For example, let's just choose a random generator, because there are 4 random generators for each part, which will just generate a random value on each new step. And then, we can just set the destination to note and then dial up the amount, and now we will have randomly adjusted notes. We can also set something else as a destination, for example, the gate length or a step delay, swing amount, velocity, the position. So we can do lots of cool stuff with that. Let's set the delay, for example. So now we have a random delay on each trigger. So this is pretty cool to spice up your sequences. We also have a trigger probability here, which is by default at the maximum value. And if we decrease that, it will randomly leave out triggers. Random timing also lets you randomize the timing, which is similar to what we already did with the randomized delay parameter. And strum will let you strum polyphonic notes. So if you have a chord, for example, you can set strum here to a higher value and it won't play all the note values of the chord at the same time, but it'll space them out a little bit, just like when you strum a guitar, for example. Alright, so those were all the sequencer features that you have for each individual of the 16 parts of the Litte deFormer 3. So you can adjust this individually for each sound that you're sequencing and create really crazy rhythms and melodies. Something that you might have seen when I was jumping through the menus earlier was that there are not just 16 note tracks, one for each part, but there are also 33 controller tracks. And those are global and independent of our parts, and they just run in the background all the time. And we can use those as modulation sources, for example, for MIDI CC data, which we want to send out to an external synth we're sequencing, or we can also use the controller tracks to sequence analog gear via the CV outputs. Now each of those controller tracks looks similar to a note track. You also have a grid view here with a piano roll, and you can simply sequence your values just like that. You also have a template menu, which lets you randomize or scale the values of your track. And you also have a page or bar parameter, last step parameter, and resolution. Now the last step of controller track can actually be step number 128. So it's twice the length of a note track, so you can even sequence longer modulation with that. Instead of the mod menu, we have a CC menu here, which lets us adjust which CC value we're sending with this track on which MIDI channel. We can quantize the CV outputs, turn smoothing on and off, clear the track, and of course double it up to 128 steps. So and you have 32 of those control tracks running at the same time, all the time, which you can then use as modulation sources inside your patch here on the Litte deFormer 3. Other things you have for modulation are 16 global LFOs, 4 random generators individually for each part, and of course you can use the note, velocity, or triggers from your sequences as well as modulation sources. Okay, I hope this video gave you a good overview of the sequencing capabilities of the Litte deFormer 3. If you have any questions, go ahead and post them in the comments below this video. Like, share, and subscribe if you would like to see more videos like this, and then have fun with your Litte deFormer 3. Thanks a lot for watching.